In a world where most people watch movies and then forget about them, 3 brave heroes join forces to watch them again and then talk about them. Join them in their epic journey as they go back in time, a decade and beyond, to revisit and break down films from a vast array of genres. Do these movies hold up over time? Are they classics? Find out on Retro Movie Roundtable. Starring your hosts, Bryan Frye, Chad Robinson, and Russell Guest. Coming now to headphones in your ears.
Welcome all you lords, ladies, and knights of the Retro Movie Roundtable. Welcome to the show where we watch movies and then talk about them. I am your host, Russell Guest, and joining me today are my good friends and co-hosts, Bryan Frye and Chad Robinson. Bryan, how are you doing?
Good evening, everybody. I'm doing just fine. I hope you are.
And Chad, how are you doing, sir?
It's a good night to talk about horror.
It is, but before we get into that, guess whose birthday it is?
Crickets.
Oh, man. It's our birthday! Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, Retro Movie Roundtable. There you go.
I know.
I think our
make the
podcast
cut.
just killed itself.
Yeah.
No, it's
Yeah. We will not have a second birthday.
That's right. We have been on for a whole year. We've survived co-hosts dropping out and replacements and several guests. We're at over 2,500 downloads at this point, and all the people who hop on Facebook and say they love us, and we really appreciate that. The reviews and stuff people have given us on iTunes are super helpful because that's helped other people find the show. We're getting downloads from other countries and stuff like this, South America and Europe, and I had no expectations when we started this, and we've come so far. So and we're going to keep going farther. And so just a small pat on the back. We did it. We made it a year, and looking forward to a year two. So blow out your candle, Bryan and Chad.
Never could get the hang of that.
So Bryan, why don't you break the ice for us today?
Sure, we're just going to start with our standard, what was the last movie you saw? Chad?
I saw this list. Actually, Russell sent me a list of top horror movies from the 2010 era, and Kill List was at the top, and I hadn't heard of it. So I watched Kill List. Can't go into a whole lot, but it was memorable.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent. Russ?
The movie Tag I got from Redbox.
Oh, that's so much fun.
Yeah.
I love that movie.
It's more fun than it ever should be.
You know that's based on a bunch of guys from Spokane.
Yeah. Yeah, they had them at the end.
They're all a lot older than the guys in the movie, but looks fun. I would want to play that game with you guys. I don't know how their travel budget possibly supports their game, but I admire the fact that they do that. So it's, if you're not familiar with the movie out there, it's based on a group of tight-knit friends, and they have a game of tag going that's been going for a long time and never stops, and they drop in on each other in unexpected locations, and surprising people in audacious ways is a big part of the game. And it's a lifestyle for them, and it's a way of keeping in touch with their friends and stuff. So it's a really fun movie. Got some sentimental parts in there too. So as well as it's just, I wouldn't say it's like laugh out loud, ha 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 funny, but it's just like, man, that's really neat. And the fact that it's based on a true thing is it's feel good. So Fry recommended it to me, and so did my mom, and so I checked it out and I liked it. So thank you for your recommendation.
No problem. That's what I'm here for.
What movie did you last see, Fry?
Yeah, I watched Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles yesterday. So if you want to go with the last, are we talking last new movie I saw?
No. So you return to this one pretty frequently, it seems like.
Well, they had a sale, all 3 in a bundle on iTunes for like $9.99.
Uh-huh.
So I was like, why, yes, I would love to pay for that again. I've got it on normal DVD somewhere around the house, and I was like, you know what? Never hurts to have a digital copy of something this quality, so went ahead and snagged it. And I am talking about the 90s Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, not the Michael Bay monstrosities.
I I would defend Michael Bay on that one and say I'd like his better. But that's
I would vote you off this
Boo.
podcast.
Boo.
Yes, boo this man.
Anyway, so first question. What is a horror movie that truly unsettled you? Chad.
The movie Creep. The entire movie is very unsettling, and you're just left with kind of a feeling of sadness.
Solid. Solid. Russ?
I'm gonna say that for me, it was one of the early ones that I saw. I said that horror movies weren't that amazing and they were all dumb and none of them were that scary. And, this is probably just an ignorant point of view that I have as a young kid, just like maybe even being afraid of them. So you write them off as being dumb. And my mom noticed that The Exorcist happened to be coming out in the theaters at that point, and she said, this one's really good and it is really scary. And so I went to the theater with my mom to see The Exorcist on a summer day on its re-release, anniversary re-release. And some probably about 13, 14, maybe 4, I think 14. And man, oh man, that chilled me. It is still the scariest movie I've ever seen. And the fact that it's a child in danger and, a parent trying to take care of them, it shook me to my core. It's just so incredibly well made. You're going to hear more about that tonight. So yeah, for me, The Exorcist shook me in a way that I'm not sure another movie is going to shake me at this point, but I'm always open. I'm always open to the experience.
For a long time, I felt very anesthetized to a lot of horror. Like I am more of the you can startle me horror, but I don't get that deep-seated, like, this bothered me for a while afterward sort of horror until I saw the movie From Hell about Jack the Ripper. And I watched that movie and I was like angry for a month after I saw that movie, just an angry person. And I just realized it just came from how unsettling that film was. And yeah, man, I remember leaving the theater. I was with John and Lindsay, and I was like, does anybody else feel like that movie just pole vaulted over so many lines? So anyway, I'm going to go with From Hell, Johnny Depp, Jack the Ripper.
Interesting. Maybe there'll be some of that soon.
All right, so question number 2 is going to be, what horror movie were you afraid of as a kid? So like you heard about it, you wanted no part of it. Chad.
Hellraiser for me. Pinhead was always just this menacing figure and just creepy looking all over. You hear about the Cenobites, you don't even know what that is, but it's a word when you're younger that you're like, I don't want anything to do with this franchise. Now, I've gone back as an adult and watched them, but as a kid, I think he was probably the scariest of the monsters.
All right. Russ?
I hate to be one note about this, but it was Hellraiser. To me, I went in the rental store and I saw Pinhead on the cover of it, and that simple image of Pinhead's face, of the nails going into his face, that all white face and the entirely black eyes. It was something that I kind of didn't want to stand and look at, but at the same time, every time I would go to the store, I kind of knew where it was and I'd like walk by it. So it's like that scary house on the street that you like kind of walk by and you're like kind of being brave, just walking by it. But the very thought of sitting down and watching that movie, I thought that had to be the scariest movie of all time. And it is scary, by the way. He puts it all out there on display on the front of the box, and so that's why when the cover is that scary, it was menacing to me. So I'm gonna go with Hellraiser.
No, that's solid. Like many of my answers to this requires a little bit of a background story. When I was a kid, my grandmother's friend Doris Johnson was an extra in the very beginning of Stephen King's Silver Bullet. And I remember watching the movie with my grandmother, and I was way too young for that movie. And I remember thinking, I probably don't need to watch anything like this again. And this is right around the same time that It was introduced. And to this day, I own the original movie It. To this day, I have still never watched it.
Oh, man.
So I have it. I haven't seen the remakes. it's one of those things that I'm like, I just need to do this. Like, what are you doing? But I have yet to ever watch it.
They're good.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's my understanding.
I still say watch the original first if you get a chance, just to appreciate it for when it came out, and then go back and watch the new one. I think that's definitely the order that I would recommend it in.
Oh, sure.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I mean, I own the original, so I'll definitely watch that one first. But yeah, it's just been one of those things. And I can appreciate like meme humor from it. I know enough about the book and I understand the premise and everything like that. But at the time and then growing up, I literally was just like, I don't think I need that clown in my life.
Neither did the kids from Derry.
I'm not spoiling anything by it, but strap in. They're gonna throw you right into things right away in that movie. So,
All right. All right. So question number 3: what horror movie did your spouse nearly kill you for making them watch?
Yeah, I've shared this before, but I made my wife watch the movie Scream, and she doesn't like horror, period. But I've kind of dialed in, and Scream was the one that set it off, that the more realistic serial killing type slashers are the ones that keep her up. So she woke me up in the middle of the night. She was asleep and just goes, ah! and sits straight up, and she had had a nightmare basically about Ghostface. I'm up for a solid hour and a half with a heart rate of about 180 in complete fight or flight. And yeah, those types of movies set her off. She is fine with the supernatural. She thought Paranormal Activity was dumb. It's the more grounded, realistic slashers that just are big no-nos.
Okay. Russ? Have you been nearly murdered by Mary?
well, I haven't been. Mary enjoys a lot of my movie tastes, and it's similar in horror. So if she were here right now, she would probably be seconding almost everything I'm throwing at you. And so when I said what movie truly chilled me at a young age, she got it later than I did, but she didn't grow up watching horror movies very much. And so it's something that we kind of had fun together. I think it's a good date movie thing. I mean, scary movies are in general. I don't know if you guys agree or not, but like when you guys are scared, you have a tendency to cling on to your girlfriend or your boyfriend and just ride the roller coaster together. And so certainly one of the earlier horror movies that we started on, when Mary would say like, I don't really like horror movies, and I said, you know what, a lot of them are bad, but there's some really good ones out there, and which is identical to the pitch that my mom gave me a long time ago. And I said, let's go do The Exorcist. And oh man, did I mention it was skillfully made? Because in that, it's got a long start in, but boy, once things picked up, Mary said, I need to turn this off. I just can't. I can't. It's too much for me. And like, she was a little bit like shaken, she could see her quivering, and we had to stay up for a while because it was nighttime in college. It was definitely after 11. So we stayed up, and I think we watched, I think it was the Beverly Hillbillies on late night, just like regular cable TV, and ate peanut butter crackers, and then went to bed. So we had to have a strong palate cleanser and a good time before we went to bed. And years later, she returned to it again. I want to say we were out of college at this point, and she made it through, and she said, that is absolutely terrifying. That was hard to get through, but my goodness, is that a good movie.
Excellent. My wife will never let me live this down. It is seriously to this day. I actually ruined dates for us for a while because we started off really strong, like you were saying. I took her to a lot of horror movies. Our first date was 13 Ghosts, that classic there. Anyway, so we started off like really watching horror movies, and then I took her to see The Ring, and she has yet to see a horror movie with me since. At one point, I almost got her to go see one, and then she found out that in it were more girls with dripping wet hair, and she was like, nope, hard pass. So yeah, I don't think I've watched a horror movie with her since the early 2000s.
So it was a big one for the era, for sure.
Yeah.
Like I mean, I don't think people were accustomed to being scared like that when that movie came out. So to what you're saying, I think that was a common response at the time because I feel like the scares were starting to kick back up several notches at that point in time.
Sarah was out on those. It doesn't do it for her. She doesn't find them scary at all.
Well, then we had Chad calling us after we get out of the movie. 7 days. It's like, thanks, Chad.
You're welcome.
Caller ID.
Wasn't a thing in 2000.
I think it was.
Yeah, color ID. So yeah, I mean,
Well,
Yeah,
I
you called me on
wasn't
my
rich,
on my
rich enough
Nokia.
for it. Yeah, my Nokia did not have that plan.
Oh, it's just if you save the number. The caller ID part was based on whether or not you were going in and creating a directory.
I was gonna say I didn't even have a cell phone at that
Just
point, but the
recog-
house had color
Just
ID.
recognize- Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, that's the three questions for this time around. So let's start talking about some horror.
So we're going to throw you guys a curveball too. We're going to walk through the 70s, 80s, 90s, O's, and maybe at times talk a little bit about today, but mostly the 70s, 80s, 90s, and O's. And we're going to have a little bit of a debate about which decade is the best to the worst, and this time for the horror genre because it's Halloween time. So I'm excited to get into this. So why don't we just start off with the 70s, and let's just start by saying like 70s movies. Let's go at it. Brian, what did the 70s horror genre mean to you?
Well, back in the 60s and 70s, they were really making a transition from your classic horror, your Nosferatu kind of stuff, Frankenstein, to modern day horror, which were basically more aggressive, ruthless killers, more of a focus on artistic style and societal themes. So you really got to see the transition between what was considered horror classic and what we now, I mean, obviously we've gotten even more aggressive now, but this is where it started with that more aggressive feeling horror movie.
I would venture to say that Alfred Hitchcock and maybe some other movies like Rosemary's Baby, Night of the Living Dead in the 60s, you start to see modern horror cinema emerge, whereas everything before that in the 50s, I'm not saying it's not scary, and there's definitely some important stuff that leads up to that, but I'm with you, Brian. I think the 60s where stuff really stopped being like goofy or gimmicky or like, funhouse scary and started turning into that's downright unsettling, and they're very mature scares. And as you go into the 70s, I think the 70s in general is a time for adults. It's not a good time for kids movies in general, and these movies are really designed for adults, and they're just like you said, there's a sense of violence to them and grittiness to them in the 70s that as things go forward are maybe more fun in later decades, but the 70s is down to business. We're here to scare you. Is that a fair statement, Chad?
Yeah, I think of the 60s with Psycho really starting it all, but as far as the 70s go, everything gets ratcheted up. You're going to have your top 10 to 50 horror movies of all time. You're going to see a lot of 70s representation.
Absolutely. So why don't we talk about a couple of hits for you? So, Brian, are there any things that represent the 70s horror scene to you?
Well, you first start getting your taste of Stephen King. Obviously, I went back and rewatched a lot of this much later after my Silver Bullet experience. But yeah, Stephen King steps onto the scene. We get to see basically the first swing at so many classic horror movies that now they are redoing like it's their job. So I feel like if imitation is the best form of flattery, it was a very, very flattering decade. And one of my all-time favorite horror movies, it's my number one out of my top 10 for the 70s, is Alien. Absolutely love that movie. I don't think you can do much better.
I'm glad you brought this up. Alien, obviously, the series is definitely under the science fiction genre, but the first movie in particular by Ridley Scott, it's a horror movie, isn't it, Chad?
Absolutely. It's very much, it learns from Jaws that actually came out the same decade. So Alien is a less is more approach. You don't see the xenomorph very often. It's more just popping quickly in and out of corridors and pipes, and there's a
Let that suspense carry you.
yeah, I it's my favorite in the franchise. I know a lot of people like Aliens. It's more action oriented, but the sheer terror of Ridley in Alien is just that's my favorite.
I'm with you on that. And I'm with you in terms of people also say that Aliens is their favorite. And when I first saw Aliens, I was like, yeah, it is even better. I bought into that narrative. And I went back, and Alien has a higher rewatch value for me. And it also, that suspense that's in it, I think that's a trademark that what we're seeing in these 70s movies. Suspense is a big thing. I think Hitchcock told us that, if I've got a bomb, that's not scary. But if I tell you under the table I've got a bomb, and you don't know when it's going to go off, that's even scarier. That's suspense, and that's the power of suspense that Hitchcock was telling us that. And I think he had made a ripple effect that carried us into the 70s, and you get a lot of novels in specific where there's character and there's suspense and buildup in these. And I think that's a big part of why the 70s movies are different than what we're going to see later as we go into the 80s. But suspense is a big part of it as well. So, and then also for the most part, I'd say a lot of them were made with lower budgets. And so it's interesting to see that this genre had constraints on them, and that forced them to be clever with their camera work, and limitations on what you could do technologically made them careful with what they show and what they don't show. And I would argue the fear of what you don't see is always going to be greater than the fear of what you do see. I don't know if that's a fair statement, Brian.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. I think that there was a lot of new territory being pioneered here, and yeah, absolutely, it's going to be hard to beat this decade in terms of horror.
I'm with you. I'm going to show my hand here a little bit. I admire the 70s. I don't have the depth and number of movies necessarily that I do later on. This is just a fact of, more movies come out
when you grew up.
Yeah, it has to do with when I grew up, and it has to do with the fact that more movies get released. So there are more movies being released in this decade, in the 2010s, than there were in the 1970s in general. So by default, there will be more horror movies. So I think it's important to not only look at quantity, but to also distill it down to quality. So Chad, what do you think? This is an era of suspense, character-driven development, and creative filmmaking for the most part.
Well, that's true. For me, it's the introduction of the slasher. Texas Chainsaw Massacre is... I feel like Halloween gets a lot of credit for the slasher, but Texas Chainsaw Massacre is where it all really started. And this movie just was a phenomena. Part of it was they advertised it as based on a true story. And it's about as true as Jack and Rose on Titanic. But... people really bought into that, and just the sheer lechery of the family, the gruesome grittiness of it all, it really changed the tone and set the tone for movies like Halloween to really perfect the formula.
As we mentioned before, House of a Thousand Corpses absolutely ripped off their whole story and redid it pretty much in a very bad way.
Yeah.
That's another one that, it didn't bother me in any sort of psychological standpoint, but I felt gross after I saw that movie.
But Texas Chainsaw Massacre, man, I would say it's the most brutal movie. Even as we go into the 2000s, you're going to start to see some shifts in the way movies are made, and you're going to see, I think, I'll go ahead and mention it now, the torture porn genre comes out. I think in a way Texas Chainsaw Massacre also gives rise to that, because there's some scenes where it's just like, oh man, how do you not look away? And so what I said, what you don't see is always scarier than what you do see. Texas Chainsaw Massacre is just ugly. It puts it in your face. So.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and 3 years later you get The Hills Have Eyes, which has another incredibly difficult scene to watch, and it doesn't shy away from it.
Yeah, I agree. The other one, I mean, you mentioned Jaws earlier. I count this as a horror movie. It really scared people at the time, and that's also the rise of the summer blockbuster. So that's your first summer blockbuster, and it showed big box office returns for horror. You know, as Chad mentioned, Halloween as well. So it shows and lays the groundwork that this thing is going to be a big marketing thing. Horror movies go on to become a bigger thing because of what happened in the 70s.
It was Jaws is my number 2.
Yeah, it's up there for me.
So
Some
Alien and Jaws.
yeah,
Heading up the list.
and then before we move on to the 80s, I just want to throw out some movies out there: Dracula, the Frank Langella version, The Omen, Wicker Man, Salem's Lot, Amityville Horror, Dawn of the Dead, Carrie, The Exorcist, Jaws, Suspiria, Halloween, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, The Brood, and Last House on the Left.
Oh, Black Christmas,
Yeah,
the
yeah,
better version.
I was gonna say Chad's going to complete all of these for me, I'm sure. So what did I leave out, Chad?
Did you say Dawn of the Dead?
Yeah, I might not have left that one out. 78, Dawn of the Dead. So yes, as well.
Yep.
Good
But
one.
Black Christmas, another great slasher, not the remake, but the original.
Yeah. So I think with that, should we move into the 80s?
Yeah, let's go.
Okay. So 80s come in. Politically, things change. You know, the dark times and coming off the Vietnam War of the 70s melts away. There's a party time of the 80s that come in. There's an excessiveness. You see it in music and other forms of entertainment. And so there's a materialistic mentality to the 80s, and technology plays a bigger role than before. So the 80s, what does that mean for horror, Chad?
It honestly gets a lot lighter in tone for the most part. You do see the rise of even more slasher franchises. So this is where Friday the 13th comes in, Nightmare on Elm Street. You also get the Evil Dead series. I don't know if I'd classify that as slasher, but you really start seeing Child's Play is another slasher franchise that comes in. But there's a lightheartedness to the Chucky. Even when you hit the Evil Dead 2, it starts being a little cornier and they lighten up. And of course, my favorite part of this is the rise of the creature features. So you get Gremlins, you get Critters. Those are just fun franchises. Stephen King gets in here with Cujo, Pet Sematary. So you're seeing a lot of these kind of science fiction oriented creatures haunting people now.
That's a good point.
Oh, I was going to say, yeah, absolutely. Stephen King is hands down to horror what Nicholas Sparks is to romance.
Oh.
He just writes it for the movie.
I think Stephen King is the backbone of the 80s scene here, personally. I think it starts off with The Shining, and that is just an amazing movie. Pet Sematary was another really great one on his part. Cujo, I mean, he was just rolling them out, and even later, like even his short stories were getting turned into movies with things like Cat's Eye.
I think that one of the best movies in terms of suspense, and this goes kind of back to that Alien piece, and it is in fact an Alien in this one too, movie we've already done on the podcast, is The Thing. It was one of the first horror movies that I ever really remember watching as a newer thing. I mean, it was made before I was born, but one of the ones that I made a point to watch, being such a big Alien fan. So yeah, I just they did a lot in that. I think that you get to see a couple of these movies where they really use weather to their advantage, more rural nature, people out on an island or in the frozen tundra or something, as in The Shining and The Thing. And I don't know, there's something about like Antarctic base horror where that sort of lost mentality really plays into that suspense factor.
Yeah, even with Evil Dead, it's cabin in the woods.
Right.
What I found interesting was really the science fiction influence. You know, you mentioned the Thing, which is a very it's an extraterrestrial life. You've got Critters, which are aliens. You've got the movie Aliens. And then you've got Predator.
Yep,
So
Predator.
you've got a lot of these more invasion.
And keep in mind, folks, we had two future state governors.
Yes.
Good point. The Fly is another good science fiction one that you're getting into as well.
Fly, solid,
Oh, yeah.
solid.
Yeah, another creature science fiction.
I'll tell you, there's another. It didn't make my top 10, but it's an honorable mention from the 80s. I really enjoyed American Werewolf in London.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely.
I think that was a fantastic one. And it's one that I feel like just doesn't get talked about very often.
It's still probably the best transformation scene as far as a werewolf movie, and that includes the Howling series.
I was just going to say, so that's a good example of why the advances in technology and movie magic, particularly through the rapid development of practical effects, is changing the way horror movies are made in the 80s. And I think, like you mentioned there, Chad, American Werewolf in London is the best example of this. You know, The Thing is another good example too. So,
Oh, yeah. And this features my favorite horror movie of all time, A Nightmare on Elm Street. So, it's near and dear to my heart.
You know, I was actually trying to think. I think Alien wins, but The Thing is probably a close second for my favorite of all time. They both head up their respective decades as my number ones.
I'm with those are great choices, by the way. And I just wanted to point out that Chad mentioned earlier, like, the fun is starting to enter into this. And I don't know how you feel about this, Brian, but I feel like I can have a fun time with a horror movie like this, but it doesn't take me to that upper level. Like, it'll lead me into that like 3.5 star kind of area, but where it really resonates and like shakes you, or I guess truly scares you. I think I don't necessarily love that kind of whimsy or playfulness in my horror movies as much, and I can still have fun with them and I will enjoy them. But like, you know, like what we were talking about, The Thing, The Shining, Alien, The Fly, Pet Cemetery, these movies get me, whereas some of the other things like Nightmare on Elm Street or...
Let me make a statement here and just tell me if you agree with this or not, both of you. So I think that you can still enjoy a horror movie today, but as you go from 1970 to today, we are now, starting in the 80s, we are walking into a point where horror movies are more take it or leave it. They lose a lot of that wow factor, and they start becoming more mass produced and have less grip. And then even as you march in, and I'm not trying to get ahead of ourselves or anything, but even as you march into the 2000s, where let's make every movie as gory as we possibly can, like it just, I feel like there was a craft, like a Clive Barker, Wes Craven, there was a craft that was lost somewhere between 1990 and 2005, and they have kind of wandered on aimlessly as zombies after it since, if that makes sense.
No, I'm with you. I think they're just so proud of their animatronics, their, you know, slime, their, you know, latex foam creatures, and, you know, the machinery and puppetry behind this stuff. So I think that there's advances that you can appreciate, but it doesn't necessarily lead to a better movie. I think, like you mentioned before, Fry, the grip's not there because a lot of those movies from the 70s are taken off of novels. And again, if you remove Stephen King from this, there's a depth that we're starting to lose with the movies in the 80s, and unfortunately that trend's going to continue going forward.
Horror movies are, I mean, to your point earlier, they're immensely profitable when you don't have to spend a lot of money making them, for the most part. I mean, there are some big budget horror movies, but especially some we're going to talk about later, they're made for pennies on the dollar, and just the return you can get. And these 80s movies, man, you hit on franchise after franchise. Some of these get up to 10, 11, 12 movies. You've got Friday the 13th, Evil Dead. They've made multiple Thing movies, A Nightmare on Elm Street, Critters, multiple Gremlins. Obviously, Aliens is continuing, Hellraiser, Predator, Child's Play. These were movies that, you're right, they were they were profitable.
Halloween sequels too.
Yeah, yeah. And so the 80s really got those franchises that could stick, and they stuck around for 2 decades.
Yeah, but I think there's such diminishing returns on those.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm not saying that there aren't some gems out there because every decade has a few where, it was worth seeing it and they probably did it right in terms of your budgeting and piece. But it's becoming harder to find those. And I really lay all of this blame at the feet of screenwriters and directors for these films. Like, come up with something original, make it creepy, spend the time building the story, building the suspense. Don't just be like, and now a room full of death traps. Like, it just doesn't do it the way they used to. Now it's more that we can make you jump, we can startle you, but you can't shake me.
Yeah, I think we'll talk about this more in the 2000s.
Okay. So I wanted to go back to this, though. Stephen King is such a backbone of what's going on in the 80s. I mean, The Shining was amazing. You had Pet Sematary was really good. The Dead Zone with Christopher Walken. You had Cujo. You had Christine with a John Carpenter movie. Again, that's a little more playful, but it's still, I like this one as well. Cat's Eye. I mean, he's all over the place. I mean, whereas they're running low on substance, Stephen King adds a lot of integrity to the 80s.
It's an angry lamp monster. Ooh.
Well, by later on, we're going to start to run out of run on fumes of Stephen King, and it's not going to. Again, once he starts running on the lower parts of his works, then the movies start to suffer too. So, yeah, there's things later on like Graveyard Shift and stuff like that, and Thinner. Oh man, those didn't go well. So,
Although Gerald's Game, recent movie, but turned out really well. It was just a novella, but the movie really translated. So if you haven't checked that out, go see Gerald's Game.
Oh, there are some massacre films out there. Like, they did a film for the Langoliers. I don't know if you ever saw that monstrosity.
No.
That was extra bad. It may have been a made-for-TV movie, but it was a Stephen King novella. Secret Window with Johnny Depp.
Yeah.
Ouch. But yeah. You can't make them all. They're not all movie worthy.
okay. And the 90s is what is next on the list, and people love this golden era of horror movies, don't they? This is what everybody champions as a wonderful time for horror. Is that right, Chad?
No, this is not true.
I will tell you that there are more 1990s bad horror movies that I love than any other decade. Like, it was definitely it in the early 2000s. There are some under the radar, never talked about. I wouldn't even call some of them cult horror movies I love.
It's interesting that we were talking about the diminishing returns of slashers. You're seeing them fizzle out here really bad. The Hellraiser series is running on fumes. Child's Play, as I think we mentioned in last week's episode on Halloween H2 episode, that had become a parody of itself. The Leprechaun movies have come on board, and I mean, this is another level of bad. It's a transitional time for horror because they're realizing the 80s has run its course. We're about to go straight to VHS with these at this point. That's where they're going at this point. And at the end of the decade, we start to see a light towards a new era. But I was joking before when I said this is a golden age. There's a lot of bad remakes as well, and this one's starting to pop back up. So some classics that ought not be touched, like The Haunting, Psycho, Children of the Damned. These are things that probably were better left where they were.
I could, very much.
Chad, what are your thoughts on some of the 90s things?
I mean, everything you say is true, but I do enjoy some of the kind of remainder of the 80s creature features. So we wind up getting Tremors and Arachnophobia in 1990. And I do feel like they were trying a little more with a couple of the movies that came out. So we get Silence of the Lambs and Seven. So these are horror movies where it's a bit more artistic. You're getting serious players involved. So I feel like there's some quality here. And of course, Scream. The 90s really started introducing referential horror. it's the first time where horror is truly aware of itself and even the tropes that it can get caught up in.
Yes, and I think Scream obviously is I would say it had probably one of the largest impacts on the era. Like you said, that reference to other horror movies certainly comes part in Scream. And Scream's not a pure horror movie. In some ways, it's a parody / homage to other horror movies. So it does so many things at once. But Scream had a hard package to reproduce. We start to see this in other things like, again, Halloween H2O or I Know What You Did Last Summer. And there were this kind of superficial nature that starts to take over in the 90s, where it's like you're pushing a soundtrack with this, you're marketing the clothes they're wearing, you're using teen icons, and it's starting to feel very commercialized. And that's not shocking because music had become this way with the rise of the boy bands in the late 90s, and that has infected MTV, I think, for the worse. And I don't think it does any favors for the horror genre through the mid-late 90s until the very, very end, at which point, as you mentioned before, Blair Witch Project 99 starts to kind of be a shift in things, and as well as The Sixth Sense becomes a shift in things, again, 99. So there's some good stuff here at the end.
Well, let's just discuss the beginning here for a minute, because we do get some gold in the early 90s with It, Silence of the Lambs. There are some Tremors,
Misery.
Yeah. So there are some gems in the 90s.
All of those were in the first 90 and 91 though. Everything we just mentioned.
Sure. And just to toss out a couple kind of dark horses that I really enjoyed in the 90s, but From Dusk Till Dawn.
Oh yeah.
Ravenous was one of my favorite movies from the 90s. Also, In the Mouth of Madness, Event Horizon.
I will admit these are some ones that I need to see and hear, and perhaps out of losing faith in some of the 90s movies, I haven't seen a lot of the ones that you're actually mentioning now.
Oh, gosh, they're great. I wanted to jokingly toss in Lake Placid and Troll 2.
Yeah, I was going to say Lake Placid and Anaconda and some stuff like that. These go under the, whoa, this is not good, guys.
I personally think Lake Placid is a comedy. I mean, you had Betty White in it cracking jokes. You had Oliver Platt in it cracking jokes. I watched that movie and I think comedy with some alligator tossed in there.
Huh.
But back to what we were talking about in terms of the Scream, Know What You Did Last Summer kind of piece, there were some under the radar, not for the time, but now, films that I feel like get overlooked, like The Faculty, Disturbing Behavior, The Curve. All of these were those teen murder movies, and there were some really, really good bad ones out there.
I was gonna say these aren't doing it for me, man. But you're saying they're guilty pleasures then?
Yeah. It's
okay.
If I see that on TV, I'm totally watching The Faculty. I mean, that's one of it scratches an itch.
Again, I liked the soundtrack. I mean, I love Lane Staley and Tom Morello's Class of '99's Cover of a Brick in the Wall, and that I think there was some great dark music in that. But I mean,
Foo Fighters were on there.
Yeah. I mean, again, but I almost feel like some of these movies are literally pushing the soundtrack in this era, and obviously it's a marketing machine. The movie selling the gear selling the movie, and I mean they had the mechanism rolling at this time. It was definitely a product of the late MTV run before the internet really changes everything, and I think that we see that late 90s. I guess, again, the excessiveness that we talked about in the 80s has in some ways returned for a window of the dot-com bubble in the late 90s. And I can't say it does the horror genre any favors.
Probably not. I mean, there are movies from the 90s that I'll put up on a pedestal, and there are some that I just enjoy sitting in the grass with.
Something that happens in the 90s in all movies is CGI starts to emerge. And Chad, does CGI in the early 90s, or mid-90s, I should say, more so as it's emerging, what is the effect on the horror genre from CGI?
I mean, not good things come from the Leprechaun. Let's just put it out there.
Lawnmower Man?
Oh, yeah. I looked to Japan for CGI. CGI for The Ring was 1998. This was Japan's version, not the U.S. phenomenon that we've talked about earlier.
Yeah.
But that was a solid improvement on the formula. But the 90s are always a tough era where it's just should we? And when you return, you wind up with less than impactful CGI.
I agree. I think CGI I think they advanced practical effects in the early 90s, and then by the mid 90s, I think they actually start entering some times where maybe you should have used practical effects, but you didn't. And like I mentioned earlier in the 70s, out of the restraint for what they couldn't do, they don't show things. In the 90s, you're continuing to see another level of gore that, 80s started to show you the horror mechanism more, but in the 90s, I feel like they're just getting flat out dumb. And they're showing you far too much in many cases at this point. So a subtlety has gone out the window. That's like why I mentioned like Seven. They're just showing you absolutely horrifying scenes. It's not necessarily like even as like there's mystery involved with that movie, but like I mean the element of horror comes largely through what they do and what they're seeing.
What's in the box?
I mean, those are some of the biggest gross out scenes of any movie that I can think of. Those murder scenes that they go visit. Oh, man.
Do you guys consider Seven a horror movie?
Absolutely.
I do because of what I just said. It's a mystery movie first, though.
Okay. Because, like, I put that and, like, The Bone Collector with Denzel Washington and all of the different James Patterson movies, like Long Came a Spider. I understand that Seven takes gore to a different level than those other ones. But I mean, I would call it high suspense. Like it's a thriller.
Yeah, and I think. Oh, did I mention this one on the remakes that shouldn't have happened? Night of the Living Dead. That's another one. Dracula from '92. That's another one a classic that, some people hold that one up, and I will go to bat for this as a bad movie. I think Ford Coppola misses the mark on this one. Some bad acting in it. I don't know. I don't know. Like I said, there are high points to be had, and the 90s will come off as you'll say, like, hey, there's some integrity here. You have Candyman and It and The Sixth Sense and Scream and Misery, and there's some really good stuff in there. But I think you're starting to see the quantity turn to mush at this point, and the quality is really few and far between at this point. So, although I admit I have some homework to do here. Chad, what are some deep cuts from here that are good that we should know about?
Hasn't been mentioned yet, but The Craft is really fun.
Solid.
I think that would be my go-to pick.
Also, the basing movie for The Ring was 98.
Yep.
The Japanese Ringu.
Ringu.
Yep. Ringu.
I'm not sure how they pronounce that.
I don't either. I've always said Ringu because it sounds fun to say it that way, but I actually don't know. I don't have any Japanese friends.
I'm afraid if I try to pronounce it, it might come across as me making fun of something.
Chad, any other last thoughts in the 90s? I would say Blair Witch Project was the most important movie of the 90s for horror because of the change that it starts to cause.
Agreed. It's what I was talking about earlier with this low budget, very influential, makes a ton of money through literally just camcorders.
Brian, what about you? You said you had some top movies in the 70s and 80s. You said you had The Thing and Alien. Do you have a top movie from the 90s that you're in love with here?
Yeah, I'm still putting it up on a pedestal here, just because it's successfully kept me away from it for so long. I feel like some sort of due has to be paid to the fact that I still have that I've actually gone out to purchase this film, having not seen it this long and being a fan of horror movies. I don't know how I don't put that as number one overall because I'm still not watching it.
Okay. For me, it's Silence of the Lambs. It just goes to another level for me. Eating fava beans still scares me because of that movie.
Sure. As far as influentialness, like I get what you're saying about Blair Witch, but in terms of people really taking that shaky cam style and running with it, I don't feel like a lot happened with that. Whereas if you take a movie like Scream, even though it's not starting a slasher genre, if you look at how much copying happened based on the success of Scream, could we not say that it's not influential as in its original, but it was influential as a spin-off bubblegum horror?
I think the imitators weren't good, but I think Scream was influential, original, and very cool. So I'll go to bat for Scream and say it's not like the imitators.
So Scream winds up being more influential in its immediate proximity. Like we get I Know What You Did Last Summer and the sequel to that. I Still Know What You Did Last Summer. And even in Halloween H2O, we talked about this. you start getting Scream influence. But Blair Witch, we just see the influence of Blair Witch over and over in the 2000s. Really a resurgence of it later on in the 2000s. But yeah, I imagine we'll talk about that very shortly.
Yeah. And so why don't we go into this? Again, the Blair Witch is a great turning point for us. So why don't we turn with the Blair Witch and go into the 2000s? So the 2000s, this is a decade of, September 11th happens early in the decade, and it changes people's outlooks so much across the board in so many ways. It really did affect us. There's an insecure feeling, and I think that is a sobering moment in society. And I think that similarly, horror movies start to respond to that too. I mean, they're back to scare you for the first time. I think the idea of we're here to have fun, like that Chad had mentioned, that carried through the 80s, and I think is trying to be there in the 90s. It's leaving. The 20s is back and down to business. Is that a fair statement?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you start off the 2000s with one of my kind of favorite hidden gems is What Lies Beneath. But The Ring really kicks off, and like Brian spoke about earlier, for a lot of us that were in high school at the time, or even younger, this was a watershed movie for us. This was the big horror movie of our time.
Yeah, and like with Ring You in the 90s and The Ring in the 2000s, one of my favorite 2000s horror movies was Let the Right One In, which later gets remade in the 2010s.
Oh, that was such a good movie. And Chad will come back and say it's not a good movie.
I can't overstate my anger at that even being on lists. I loathe that movie and everything it represents.
The remake or the original?
The original.
Oh.
Russell recommended it to me, and I stopped talking to him for almost a month.
Wow.
I was just unobservant and didn't notice. I thought we were both just busy. So that's what happens with silent treatment with me. This happened. I had a friend who's like, I didn't talk to you for 2 weeks. I was like, you didn't? He goes, yeah, didn't you remember? I was like, when was this? He goes, you don't remember? I was like, I didn't. And he goes, Like, he was so mad. Yeah, he's like, you didn't notice I was giving you the silent treatment. I was like, I did not. I thought you were just busy, maybe. I'm sorry. We're still friends. I value your friendship.
Nice.
Yeah. So anyway, I guess Chad silent treatment me as well, and I might not have noticed. So I'm sorry. But yeah, the 2000s, M. Night Shyamalan follows up Sixth Sense with The Village, and The Grudge is another one early on, and 28 Days Later in 2003. Things are changing, and again, the intense scares are actually coming back. Chad, I think you used the term with me once. He goes, "Oh, you like to be challenged with your horror movies."
Yeah, that's fair. I don't particularly. This is gonna make me sound like a Neanderthal, but I don't like movies where you have to sit there and think and wonder and just... I want camp teenagers in tropey stereotypes getting murdered, and I want to have fun with that, and I want to see them killed in unique ways. That's what I'm here for. I'm going to take out all these popular late movies, and I'm sorry, people. I just have poor taste, apparently. But The Witch was incredibly boring.
Wait. That's the 2010s. Let's table that.
It's Chad's turn to get booed.
Yeah, that's fine. But these types of movies, I don't care for.
That's okay, and I think that's probably going to frustrate you then, because I think some of these are becoming more cerebral. Another really good one that was cerebral was Saw. Saw, again, like Halloween, was another level of good from the other movies that it later spawned as imitators. Saw was a good mystery movie. It was suspenseful. It really threw you for a trip. Like, you didn't know what was going to happen, and when it did, my mind was blown a little bit. Led to other things like Hostel, and what are some of the other torture porn series that came out as a result of this, Chad, that I don't like as much?
Just Hills Have Eyes remake.
Yeah. Anything by Eli Roth. But
or you can really toss Rob Zombie in there. Devil's Rejects.
House of a Thousand
Corpses. Yes.
What's the one with the blonde dreadlocks girl and I'm blanking on the name of it. Outside of his remakes, it was his last non-remake movie. God, that's gonna kill me. All right, no, keep going.
I did find it interesting though that you kind of see the resurgence of the zombie movie.
Oh yeah,
28
the 2000s were huge for zombie resurgence.
Yeah, 28 Days Later, 28 Weeks Later, Shaun of the Dead, Dawn of the Dead, Zombieland, and all of these are great, great movies.
Yeah, I think another interesting thing we're talking about, characters are starting to come back in these. They're not paper thin premises anymore. And so, again, The Village has a very good story to tell. 28 Days, it's a very emotional thing. They make you connected to these characters. It's not just that there's zombies running around, there's people involved at the center of it. The Descent is one of those things that's very
Ooh, Descent
suspenseful.
was good.
Yes.
Solid.
Yeah, and again, it's what you don't see is returning. I feel like some of the craft in movie making, again, Chad, I know you said you're one for just let's go slash them up, but I get excited for some of these that are really crafty. I had issues with The Mist, which was one that we talked about early in our show, and go check that episode out, by the way, a Stephen King movie, no less, that came out in 2007. That's a movie that's very character driven. I like to see the return of craft and the return of characters in the 2000s. So torture porn aside, I like a lot of the trends that we're starting to see here, and no better example than Let the Right One In.
After I saw the first Saw movie, I pretty much left the rest of that genre be. Not because Saw bothered me in any way, but I just sort of saw the direction that was going. And after I saw House of a Thousand Corpses, that's what I don't need from horror. I don't need to be shocked at the way people can be killed. And I'd really want to qualify that as in that way. Like, I like crafty killings. Like the Final Destination series was big for me. I loved seeing these odd ways that death is coming for these people. You made a point earlier, Russ, about the craft here. One of my favorite 2000s horror movies is The Others.
Yeah.
I don't know this one.
Yeah, that's a very good one.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, it's so good.
Yeah, 2000s is a weird decade, really, because it doesn't really feel like it knows what it wants to be. It's got everything. I look at Trick or Treat, which is an anthology slasher. I do really enjoy Trick or Treat. It's one of my favorite newer movies. Wrong Turn is another franchise-style slasher. There are going to be 7 of these. There are going to be
Jeepers Creepers.
Yes, Jeepers Creepers. But then you've got zombie movies, then you've got Saw and Hostile, you've got Exorcism of Emily Rose, and then all the Blair Witch influences. You've got Wreck, Cloverfield.
Paranormal Activity, we didn't mention that one.
Yep, Paranormal Activity.
Can we talk about Cloverfield for just a hot second?
Sure, absolutely.
I can't tell you how disappointed I have been in the shotgun scattering of loosely affiliated movies that have followed that. I love the first Cloverfield movie. I wish they had put more time, energy, and money into developing a franchise off of that one. I've enjoyed everything I've watched around it. I'm just saying, like, it's not timely. It wasn't timely when they made them, and it's a shotgun smattering of timeline too, talking about what happens where.
I really hated the third Cloverfield movie, Paradox, but 10 Cloverfield Lane, man, that is a movie that I feel like a ton of people missed, and they need to go see it. Yeah, that was one of the more entrancing performances that I've watched. I was riveted the entire time, and I loved it.
Speaking of John Goodman, this might have been a 90s movie I missed, but this just reminded me of it. What's the one with him and Denzel Washington? They're chasing a killer. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Oh, I don't.
Right. The movie I was trying to think of was called Fallen.
Fallen. Okay. I don't know that one.
John Goodman, absolutely watch it. I loved it.
For me in the 2000s, though, just to cap it off, Drag Me to Hell. This is the triumphant return of Sam Raimi from the Spider-Man franchise back to horror. And Sam Raimi was the Evil Dead. So I was so thrilled to see him come back to horror, come back to his roots. And he obviously just has a lot of fun coming back to it.
I'm with Brian on this one. I just want to see a continuation of characters and suspense. If you do those two things, you're going to make me happy. And I do like the art house side of things too. So sure, wow me and dazzle me with a creative way of presenting the things that we've seen before. I'm okay with not reinventing the box, but if you present it to me in a really fresh manner and you have great style, again, like Kubrick and The Shining did back in the 80s. I mean, I'm on board. Like, let's go for that ride. So I'm optimistic. Like I said, the 2010s was great. Let's rank the decades. You know, Brian, let's let you go first here. Worst to best. Let's walk us through the decades.
I'm gonna drop the 90s as the worst, which hurts me because there's a lot there to love, but there's a lot there to cringe at too.
No, that's very fair. Where do you go from there?
I'm gonna follow that up with the 80s. There's some stuff in there. One of the things we kind of glossed over when we talked about the 80s was we didn't really go with some of the misses, like, and there are some. I mean, there's some pain in the 80s horror too, but I would put 80s and 2000s probably about the same level with the 80s. Their highs are higher, but I think that some of their lows are lower also.
That's really well put between the 80s and the 2000s. I also have a tight race between those two. I'm glad you said that.
Yeah, and then follow it up by kind of direction I've been going this whole talk is the 70s are winning.
If you were to put the 2010s in, where would you slide them in? Granted that you reserve the right to change your mind in 10 years.
I have not done my due diligence on a lot of the mainstream horror that has come out in the 2010s. I've seen more of the movies that Chad's not too fond of. But I feel like I have to do more of an all-encompassing view because everything I have seen, I have really liked. So I would probably put it second right now, but I haven't watched enough to not like it yet.
That's very fair. That's a nice asterisk you put on it as well. Chad, do you want to go next?
Sure. I think I'm going to agree with Fry as far as throwing the 90s under the bus. I think they've got to be last for me, just because I love Scream, but there's really Silence of the Lambs is great, Candyman is good, but you start struggling after that. For me, after that, I think it's going to be the 2000s. I don't dig a lot of what happened in the 2000s. There are some great gems. I like some of the funniness about it, but I just don't feel like there was that movie that really sticks out as, this is a horror movie classic. Go see it.
So you don't think Paranormal Activity or Saw would be there? I'm not even going to try and let the right one in on you, but like, do you don't think one of those two might reach those levels?
I don't think I'm going to push Saw on most people, to be perfectly honest. The Ring I would recommend, but I just don't feel like there's enough. Because I have a choice of 4, and when you start looking at the iconic movies of the 70s and the 80s, it just can't compare.
Okay, so where do you go from the 2000s?
I'm going to go to the 70s. Going to differ with you guys. Yeah, it's got The Exorcist, Texas Chainsaw, Jaws, Halloween, Dawn of the Dead, and Alien. Yeah, all of these are just great, and this is no knock on the 70s, but for me, for my favorite movies, they lie in the 80s. I love Gremlins. I love A Nightmare on Elm Street, Critters, all of the goofiness that kind of comes with the 80s along with the horror. Evil Dead is just great. Poltergeist, The Thing. The 80s is just the golden era for slashers. It has creature features that I love. So that's the era for me.
Okay. And I think a lot of true horror enthusiasts at our age group or slightly older would totally agree with you. And there's a lot of people out there who are really glad that you're representing them tonight, Chad. So I'm glad you took up the that mantle. I'm very close to you guys. You can correct me if I'm saying your exact ones. I'm going to go with the 90s and last. I think you guys have stated it well. There's a lot of bad stuff. There are some high points, but not nearly as many, and they're not nearly as high. And there's a lot of bad stuff to sift through. Just a weak era. 2000s, I'm going to go with next. And I was really struggling, like Brian, to go 80s or 2000s. I feel like the 2000s overall is stronger. There's more integrity, and the low points are... There's some disposable bad low points in it, but I feel like there's less failure in the 2000s. Whereas in the 80s, the high points are so high and they're really good. And I think they're advancing on the visuals of the 70s in a way that I think things are really clicking for a lot of it. I mean, Poltergeist and The Fly, Alien, and Shining, and The Thing, and Hellraiser, and American Werewolf in London. Day of the Dead was really good too. Halloween 2 we didn't mention that as being for a sequel. That is an excellent horror movie on its own right. Dead Zone. Just there's so many good high points that I'm going to pick the 80s over the 2000s, and it's neck and neck. After that, I'm going to go with the 70s as the best. And again, if you were to take my top 10 horror movies, I think they are really taking a lot of the top spots, especially as we're looking to cut out the things that went pre-70s. The 70s really is going to stand up as, the weight is there. And I haven't even seen as many of them. So I've admittedly probably seen fewer flops because the bad ones by this point, you don't watch them from the 70s. So it's a little bit of revisionist history when you don't see the failures that came out of the era. But I can tell you this much. The high points outweigh the high points of any other decade for me. So
yeah, go watch Barracuda and get back to me.
I'm okay. That and like I said, I'm fully acknowledging the bad stuff from the 70s has fallen behind, and we're putting rose-tinted glasses on to some degree. And if I were to insert the 10s, I would put them in second place. I'm like Fry. I've got some homework to do. It takes me a couple of years to really get caught up, and as well as to let it ruminate and decide for sure. So it's with an asterisk that I say if I had to place it, it would be second. So I'm almost next to Brian. I think I have the 80s and 2000s swapped.
Yeah, my issue with the 2010s and why I don't know that I'd rank it that high is, will it stand the test of time? I feel like Conjuring will be there, but are there going to be those horror movies that are just held up, or are we just having fun right now? I really like a lot of what I've seen out of the 2010s, but I just don't see them becoming classics or mainstays. I'd love to see Peach Fuzz as a villain become, a Jason, a Freddy, a Leatherface, or any of these icons of horror, but I just don't see it.
I don't think it needs to spawn that kind of franchise. Well, The Conjuring certainly has done that, but I think Babadook and It Follows and The Witch are definitely going to be watched in 30 years later from now. So I think you are getting some of those long-lasting ones. But you're right, time will tell.
Yeah, I'd love It Follows to. I'd like the franchise treatment, or at least another movie. That was a breath of fresh air. I enjoyed it a lot.
Thank you guys for coming in here and doing this last minute notice. Next time, though, let's pick a movie for next time. What do you want to say?
Let's do it.
Sounds good.
So next time, we're going to be all over the map here with some horror movies. It's going to be Halloween time. So this one's going to take a little bit from each decade. So in keeping with the theme of this show. So option number 1, Lost Boys from 1987. After moving to a new town, 2 brothers discover that the area is a haven for vampires. Option 2, The People Under the Stairs from 1991. 2 adults and a juvenile break into a house occupied by a brother and a sister and their stolen children. There they must fight for their lives. Option 3, Drag Me to Hell from 2009. A lone officer who evicts an old woman from her home finds herself the recipient of a supernatural curse. Desperate, she turns to a seer to try and save her soul, while evil forces work to push her into a breaking point. So, Chad.
Oh, I am so excited for everyone. This is one of my favorite newer movies, so I've got to go with Drag Me to Hell.
Okay, Drag Me to Hell it is. So guys, thank you so much. This was fun to do on a short notice, and I hope the listeners out there liked it too. Let us know what decade you like the most, and tell us why we're wrong. If you love 90s horror movies, stand up for them. Tell us what you like about them. If we've overrated the 70s, explain. Settle the debate for once and for all. Is Let the Right One In a good movie or not? So.
Oh, I'm going to lose this one in a landslide.
Thank you, Russ.
Thank you, all the lords, ladies, and knights of the Retro Movie Roundtable. We invite you to reach out to us. We want to hear from you. Subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes or Apple Podcasts. Those ratings really help the show more than anything. It's the #1 source of podcasts, and so that helps other people come up in the searches, and that's the biggest thing you can do to help the show. Also, give us proper ratings on Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, wherever you get your podcast. Give us a like on Facebook. We want to engage with you, and this is one of the best places to do it. We'll put out the show that we're doing each week, and that's a great opportunity for you to comment on the show and have some fun. Follow us on Twitter at @movie_retro. And email us at retromovieroundtable@yahoo.com if you want to go into more depth or if you want to be on the show yourself. As always, thank you for listening. Be good to each other and watch more movies. Brian?
It's lonely being a cannibal. Tough making friends.